Right now, at a high-end seafood restaurant, someone is paying over $60 for a single lobster tail. They are sitting under dim lighting, a white cloth napkin on their lap, dipping each bite into warm butter like they are eating something sacred. But if you roll the clock back 2.5 centuries and travel up the coast to a prison in Massachusetts, you will find inmates staring down at the exact same animal on their plates, absolutely furious about it. The prison prisoner angry because being forced to eat lobster was considered a literal form of cruelty. The creature that dominates modern luxury menus was so utterly despised that feeding it to inmates too often was viewed as a punishment on the exact same level as forcing them to eat rats. Early European colonists stepping onto the shores of New England were met with an overwhelming volume of the crustaceans. After storms, dead lobsters would wash up on the beaches in piles 2 feet high. And these were massive specimens, regularly weighing 5 or 6 pounds, with some topping 20 pounds or more. The biology of the animal hasn't changed a bit in 300 years. So how did a bottom-feeding creature that people treated as literal ocean garbage transformed into one of the most expensive foods on the planet? To early colonists and Native Americans, lobster was a tool, not dinner. They threw them into pig troughs as livestock feed. They ground up the shells and scattered them across garden beds to fertilize their crops. Eating the meat yourself carried a deep social stain. People actively hid the evidence. Impoverished families who had to rely on lobster for calories would wait until dark to bury the shells in their backyards, terrified that neighbors would see the piles by their door and realize how badly they were struggling. The animal's worthlessness had nothing to do with its flavor. It was entirely a byproduct of its localized overabundance. Because there was an endless, rotting supply of it on the beaches, consuming it became heavily stigmatized. The shift from fertilizer to fine dining was never planned. There was no marketing board trying to fix the lobster's reputation. It started entirely by accident in the 1840s, driven by early tin can technology. As railroad tracks stretched across the continent, companies had to figure out how to feed thousands of passengers on multi-day trips without bankrupting the dining car. Lobster, still dirt cheap at the docks, provided the answer. It could be tinned, packed in crates, and shipped thousands of miles without spoiling. This map illustrates the massive information gap of the 1800s. People living in the Midwest had zero knowledge of the coastal jokes. They had never seen the rotting 2-foot piles on the beach, and they were completely unaware of the poverty stigma attached to the meat. When inland passengers tasted the meat on the dining cars, they judged it purely on its own merits. They found a sweet, tender protein. They went home to places like Ohio and Missouri, raving about this rare, exotic seafood, and genuine market demand spiked. Physically separating the food from its geographic origin wiped the slate clean. That blind taste test was the required first step to erase centuries of shame. Back on the coast, shipbuilders were introducing well-smack boats. These fishing vessels featured built-in hull tanks that let cold seawater circulate freely, keeping lobsters alive for much longer hauls. Suddenly, live catch could survive the journey to Boston and New York. For generations, colonists had eaten poorly prepared, dead-boiled lobster, which spoils incredibly fast and turns to mush. Now, wealthy tourists visiting Maine were eating lobsters boiled alive and served with melted butter. The culinary difference was enormous. The trend hit the cities hard. In 1876, Delmonico's in New York debuted Lobster Newburg, sautéing the meat in butter, flaming it with sherry, and finishing in rich cream. Soon, massive, lavishly decorated lobster palaces opened around Times Square. If you wanted to signal to society that you were cultured and wealthy, you ordered the lobster. This explosive industrial demand from canneries and high society restaurants rapidly stripped the ocean of the giant 20-pound lobsters. For the first time in history, the animal was actually becoming scarce. By the 1920s, high society endorsement had collided with a shrinking biological supply. The sea cockroach was firmly established as a premium status symbol. Then the Great Depression hit, and the luxury market collapsed overnight. The gilded doors of the lobster palaces shuttered, and in Maine, the crustacean instantly reverted to a desperation meal. Impoverished fathers crept along the rocks at low tide to gather whatever they could carry. The deep social shame returned in full force. Coastal children bringing lobster sandwiches to school would hide their lunchboxes, deeply humiliated because everyone knew it meant their family couldn't even afford bologna. The narrative was sliding backward. But it was rescued by one final historical accident during World War II. The U.S. government implemented strict food rationing policies. Meat, sugar, butter, and cheese were heavily controlled. But bureaucrats considered lobster so unimportant that it slipped completely through the cracks. It was entirely unrationed. Families who couldn't use their coupons for steak or pork started buying the available lobster instead. This bureaucratic loophole forced Americans to buy it by default, cementing a national taste for the meat right as the country entered a massive post-war economic boom. Today, the $60 price tag is a direct reflection of the physical struggle on the working waterfront. The luxury brand remains, but the cost is now being propped up by a collapsing ecosystem. Climate change is actively altering the Gulf of Maine. As ocean temperatures rise, lobster populations are migrating into much deeper, colder waters, massively increasing the fuel cost and difficulty of catching them. This chart shows the sheer quantitative drop in the modern supply. In 2016, Maine lobstermen hauled in a record 132 million pounds. By 2025, that number plummeted to roughly 79 million pounds, hitting a 15-year low. That collapsing supply, stacked on top of rising gear costs and incredibly strict state conservation laws, drives the dock price to record highs. By the time it reaches a restaurant plate, the wholesale cost has tripled. The $60 entree we see today is anchored in actual scarcity. It is a complete reversal from the colonial era, where the abundance was the very thing that made it worthless. The animal served on fine china beside a glass of champagne tonight is biologically identical to the creature colonists crushed into paste for their crops in 1623. It proves that economic value is often just a story we tell ourselves. It is dictated by accidental context, geographic distance, and the simple math of supply and demand, rather than an inherent truth about the product. Somewhere in the history of a Massachusetts prison, an inmate went on a hunger strike because he was furious about being fed lobster 3 days in a row. He would be absolutely stunned to look at a modern menu and see what his punishment meal costs today. It took 300 years of logistical quirks, government loopholes, and pure accidents, but the ocean's garbage managed to pull off the greatest rebrand in culinary history.